All right, so we'll get to the second presentation of the day, which happens to be my presentation. And I'm going to talk about my PhD research, where I was looking at analog studies in regards to founding new Mars villages. As said, my research is about remote villages as heterotopias. A heterotopia, that's a expression that was coined by the French philosopher Michel Foucault, and it comes out of the utopia-dystopia spectrum, where heterotopia is the a third variation that he adds the other place. Michel Foucault, when he talks about heterotopias, speaks about places that we would associate with negative places, such as prisons, military academies, or mental hospitals. I have in my own research sided more with Hetherington, who has found that heterotopias are what he calls places of utopics. And now utopics is something different to utopia, because utopics is the process of striving towards utopia, which I'm pretty sure you all agree is what we're going to do when we go to Mars. We're going to strive towards creating a utopia. Now you could argue, and I argue along with these people, it's not possible to create a utopia, but you could strive towards utopia. And when this happens, when you strive towards an utopia, interesting things happen. You get a place that is full of innovation, a place where people that might not otherwise find their place in a the mainstream society start to thrive. So in remote situations for Mars, there's the classical analogs, like Mars Society's own Mars Desert Research Station, which you can see on the slide on the left-hand side down, or DMARS, for example, which is an Israeli project where the Austrian Space Forum has been heavily involved. What these classical analog situations do is they look at the early exploration stage, where you'd have a crew from anywhere between 3 or 5 to 7 people. And you're not actually settling down, rather you'd spend a good year in most scenarios on Mars and then you go back. So this is a very different situation to the situation when you actually start to settle down and found new village, which lead me to the question, what do we actually know about finding new villages? Because, you know, the thing is, we're just not very much doing it anymore on Earth. For the most part, the settlements that exist now have been in existence for centuries. So we're not very experienced in founding villages in a structured way, which, given that we might be on our way to Mars within a decade or maybe 2, and heterotopic villages or remote villages in general are very diverse. So different to the classical rural village, when you're out in a remote village, you might be very different from a neighboring village. A classical example that I've actually seen in northern Sweden, 2 villages about 60 kilometers from each other. The one was founded by the military because they needed an outpost there and needed support for that. The other one was founded around the same time, but instead by what you today would call entrepreneurs, people starting their homesteads, wanting to take their own fate into their own hands. So what is happening is, of course, these 2 villages have developed a very different character. The former one, even today, is very heavily reliant on centralization and probably responds better to a central government than the other would do. The entrepreneurial village, the second village, even today, is a village of entrepreneurs with a very high spirit of doing it yourself, making it happen yourself, taking charge. If you're out there looking at remote villages, you find everything. There is, if you look on a global perspective, there's religious villages, secular villages, entrepreneurial villages, there's eco villages, there's everything from a quasi-socialist village like the kibbutzim in Israel to very entrepreneurial villages. It's a great diversity, which is something that I can very much see on Mars. Another thing about heterotopic villages, is they're dynamic. They're in a constant state of change, which is probably something that you wouldn't normally associate with the countryside because it has a wrong reputation of being a bit backward. But as a matter of fact, these villages change and adapt to their surroundings all the time as people change and adapt. In a lot of these villages, people come and go all the time. Young people might leave to go to university. New families are coming in. So it's a very dynamic place. At the same time, these small villages are sensible to very small changes, just because they are so dynamic. So if the right person moves in, the right person moves out, this can have a huge impact at the village, both how it works and if it works at all. And then, of course, there's the realities of remoteness. How do you guarantee services? How do you make sure you have what you need in the village? And these remote villages have been dealing with this for centuries, so they know very much about it. Let's talk about the people in these heterotopic remote villages that I encountered. Well, again, counterintuitively to what we sometimes think about the countrysides, the people in these heterotopic villages, they tend to be highly innovative. They used to taking charge and creating their own society, their own little world out in the village according to what they want it to be. There's a very high level of entrepreneurial spirit. And by that, I don't only mean the founding of companies. By this, I mean also a mindset of getting things done, moving things along, growing things. Very often the people in remote villages are sustainability minded. There's a lot of all variations of eco villages out there. And then, of course, I mentioned this on one slide earlier, talking about the realities of remoteness, the problems faced. People in remote villages are very multi-skilled and multifunctional. And by that, I mean the person that's a farmer for a day job might also happen to be your hairdresser, because if you're only 100 people in a place, you can't really afford having a full-time hairdresser. The same is true for locations. So, for example, in the Swedish countryside, there's this concept of servicepunkten. And what a servicepunkten is really you're pooling a whole lot of different services into one building, into one set of stuff. You're having a post office, a bottle store, a supermarket, a tourist office, a bank, and maybe some other functions, a pharmacy, all in one building, all serviced by one crew. And then, of course, there's this thing called sense of place. Sense of place means people feeling very strong connections, a very strong feeling of identity in a place that often a person that is not from there wouldn't understand. Think of desert places, very harsh places. If you're living in a city today, you probably think, well, you know, how could anyone be there for the place? You think the people in remote villages would be there in spite of the place. This is actually not what the research sees. So I think you can see very well how this would apply to Mars, because when you look at the attributes of remote villages, well, if you look at the list, it's exactly what we would normally associate with future Martian settlers. Highly innovative, taking charge, doing their own thing, doing their society, creating new, growing, sustainability, resource reusage, being multi-skilled, being multifunctional. Everyone going out down to Antarctica has to be halfway of a firefighter, for example. This is what we're going to see on Mars as well. And of course, the sense of place. People aren't going to move to Mars, even though it's a hostile place. They're going to move to Mars because it's a hostile place. So on the last slide, I also wanted to talk about why am I even looking at villages? Because if you're on the news, if you're following Elon Musk and all the others, there's a lot of talk about the Mars city, a Mars city of 1 million people. I'm actually questioning this. I'm questioning, do we really need a Mars city? Or will a Mars settlement reality more be a assortment of smaller settlements, research stations, homesteads, hamlets and villages, and mining outposts, as we've seen them in settlement in the past? This is also where I agree with Megan that archaeology can help us a lot, because archaeology can help us analyze past settlement into new territory and find out how it was done, what kind of settlement, how did marketplaces develop. And then, of course, as I mentioned on my last point, one thing that we will have on Mars that we will need is resources. So we will have mining outposts. So I'll leave over to today's last speaker to talk about how it might be done and why we need it.